The third core concept is the medium is part of the message, and the context within you in which you write affects the way you write. I mean, the obvious examples are like Twitter. You have 140 characters, and so you can make an argument in 140 characters, but it sure isn't going to be the same kind of argument as it would be in a 12-page paper, a traditional essay. And so part of what I want students to do is to understand how the medium can affect the message, and I want to model some of that. So I want them to see me using technology as well as to use it themselves. Most recently, I've begun to think about social media. What I'm finding with the younger students is that they're not terribly fond of email, and many of them don't use email regularly. So when I'm sending stuff out, they're not getting it regularly. Some of my colleagues are setting up Facebook pages for their classes, and they're finding that students will monitor those on a daily basis, and so they'll post messages to the Facebook page about class assignments or resources or whatever. A couple of my students suggested that I use Twitter to send out reminders. For example, drafts are due tomorrow, or don't forget to do X for Monday. I haven't done that, but I have colleagues who do that. It seems to me that these are the technologies kids are using to communicate, the younger ones in particular, such as the first-year kids coming in right out of high school, and it's worth looking at how we might use them effectively. For me now, email is a very easy way to stay in touch with kids, but I'm now in a situation where I have to make sure that my students know that that's the case. 2 or 3 years ago, I could just assume everyone was on email, and now that's beginning to change. Compatibility is becoming a challenge. I mean, it's ironic because when I first started my first academic position out of graduate school in the early 90s, the World Wide Web didn't exist yet. The internet was entirely textual. Most of my colleagues at other universities were not doing anything online. I remember my first experience teaching with an online component was in the early 90s, and it was what we used to call news groups. It was basically an online discussion thing, but it was all textual. There was no graphical interface. The graphical interface that we now know as the web wasn't really introduced until about '94. So these are pretty new technologies. Back in those days, there were so few ways to intersect with or to use those technologies that compatibility wasn't a huge issue. Now, with all the different devices that students have, different kinds of smartphones, different kinds of tablets, various sorts of online interfaces, compatibility is an issue. So here's one example. This semester, I had a student, I typically will have students submit their assignments as Word documents or text documents. I comment on them using the reviewing function and the track changes function, and it's very important that students could read that. I had 2 students this semester for the first time ever who told me that they don't use word processing. They do all of their writing on Google Docs. And so to submit their essays, they were copying the entire thing and pasting it into the body of an email message, which means that I had to convert it to a Microsoft Word document to put in all of my comments. Then I had to save it as a PDF file so that they could read the comments. So there are like 3 steps that for most students it should be, it would be only 1 step. So I've had to begin to think about, and I think all writing teachers have to think about, how to set up requirements and parameters for the uses of technology so that we're giving students the best chance to use technologies that are effective, but we're not putting them in a situation in which they have to do extra work because they're working in a medium that's not compatible with what we're doing. Yeah, I think the biggest thing about using technology to teach writing is use it to support students' writing development, not because it's a technology that people are using or that's sexy or trendy. The purpose of using technology isn't to use the technology, it's to help students become better writers. It seems to me there's two main goals here. The first is having tools that support students' work as writers, to practice the kinds of things that they have to do to be effective writers in college and the workplace and as citizens. And that's sort of teachers writing instructors using various tools to support students as writers. The other side of it is giving students practice with certain tools that they're much more likely to encounter in the workplace. Using digital writing. One of the things that I've begun to do is to encourage students to incorporate images and even video clips to create multimedia versions of their texts rather than just a standard sort of traditional essay, so that they have some experience with not just the practical task of taking, say, an image and embedding it in a Microsoft Word file, which is a fairly simple thing to do, but the rhetorical considerations. How did you choose that image? Why did you put it on page 2? How do you refer to it in the text? What work does the image do? Those are really important concepts that can enhance students' critical thinking and reinforce the rhetorical skills that we're trying to teach in the writing classroom. So that's the second component, and I've tried as much as I can to incorporate guidelines for my assignments that encourage or even require those uses of technology, so students are thinking along those lines and getting some actual experience with that technology.